What is up, guys? Welcome back to day 3, round 4 of the Orillas de Mar International Chess Tournament here in Tenerife. My name is Titus Stromavicius. I'm a Grandmaster, and I want to share my experiences and games from the event with you. So to recap the first 3 rounds, I am on 2 out of 3, 2 wins, 1 loss, and I'm in a bit of a rating deficit. I'm dropping about 6 points, which means I'm underperforming by about a half a point. So I definitely need to start racking up some wins if I want to try and salvage the event. In round 4, I get paired up against a Grandmaster yet again, but this time a women's Grandmaster, Krasteva Beloslava from Bulgaria. She is also on 2 out of 3, and even though I have the black pieces, I do outrate her by about 300 points, so I'm definitely looking to try to win the game. Now, back in the day, which is about maybe 5 to 10 years ago, I used to play a very different sort of style. I noticed that my opponent plays mostly d4 and move 1, and back in the day I would try to play f5 to go for the Dutch and try to balance the game right off the get-go. However, recently I realized that this hasn't really been working out for me that great, and I've switched almost to exclusively playing d5 on move 1 and going for Queen's Gambit decline positions. Because I noticed my results have been basically very few losses and a lot of draws, but some wins there as well. So when I was checking her games and preparing for her, I noticed that she tends to go for the Carlsbad structure. And historically, I don't really have a great track record of winning against weaker players or low-rated players in this structure and this opening. So I didn't really want to go for this because I felt like she would be comfortable and it would be difficult for me to win the game nonetheless. So I decided to go for a different strategy that I've recently employed in the national championship. So some leftover preparation from the national championship, which is bishop b7, to basically prevent the bishop from coming out to g5. So obviously white has some options here. He can transpose to some classical 2-knight systems with knight f3, knight f6. But I did notice that she always liked to take on c5, on d5. So I wasn't really too concerned about her choosing to do something different. And she does decide to take on d5, and we do get a Carlsbad structure, but now she cannot develop her bishop to g5. So she is obliged to play bishop f4 instead. And after c6, e3, bishop f5, we get the first sort of critical position of the game where my opponent gets the option to choose what she wants to do. She can either go for g4, which used to be one of the main moves back in the day. I think the main move back in the day. Now there is some different approaches according to the engine. I will get to that because that's what happened in the game. But g4 basically immediately challenges the bishop, aggressively expands on the king side. And after bishop e6, white has a couple of options usually. One of them involves h4, one of them involves h3, and there's one more with queen to d3. There's some other moves, but they usually transpose to one of these 3 tabias. And I think these positions are definitely double-edged enough where I can try to overtake the initiative and slowly but surely grind out a win. My opponent somewhat surprises me because I've never actually seen her play this, but she decides to go for knight g to e2, which is the new move that's been kind of catching the trend in recent years. Basically playing a little bit more conservative, but also having the exact same idea, with challenging the bishop from g3. Knight e7, knight g3, bishop g6, and after bishop e2, which is one of the main moves. They're not the only one, but definitely playable. I had prepared a couple of weeks ago queen b6 in this position. So I'm still following my preparation from a previous event. And after queen to d2, h5. Now there's no capture on h5 because the queen is no longer eyeing the pawn. And after h4, knight f8, played by Grandmaster Geller. In 1995, I believe, as I recall, checking my preparation. So definitely a long time ago. But I do like this move quite a bit because it's a little bit unorthodox, and it immediately causes, I wouldn't say problems, but my plan is very clear, to put the knight on e6 and immediately challenge this bishop and asking, what are you going to do? Also, because the pawn is on h4 with this setup, white is definitely reluctant to castle kingside. And castling queenside also could be dangerous potentially with this bishop on g6 still. And the queen, and basically the Carlsbad structure, your king is always a little bit under duress when you castle queenside. So my opponent takes her first long thing of the game, about 15 minutes, and she decides to go for knight e4, which I've never seen before and has never been played in the database. So it definitely came as a surprise. And I also responded with about a 10-minute think, because I wasn't sure what to do. Because I thought the move actually made a lot of sense. And the engine kind of agrees. It's also absolutely playable. And basically, the main idea is that I have, again, 3 responses in this position, which are queen b4, queen d8, and bishop b4. Bishop b4 looks a little bit weird because you forfeit the 2 bishops for no real reason. But you do get this nice sort of knuckle of pawns on the queen side. You also open up the rook. But I do think the 2 bishops outweigh these pluses, and eventually white should be slightly better. I also was considering queen to d8, but I didn't really know what to do after knight c5, and it's very tough to actually defend this pawn on b7, because I don't really want to play queen c8, because I don't think the queen does anything there. I don't want to play b6 because it would weaken my pawn chain c6 d5, and I don't really want to take because that would forfeit the 2 bishops. So queen d8 seemed like the least appealing option to me from these 3. The last option is queen b4, and that is what I played in the game. But my opponent immediately has an interesting response, which involves a pawn sacrifice with knight c5. I'm more or less obligated to take the knight after all, and after d takes c5, I have an option of trading queens or picking up the pawn. Queen to d2, I briefly considered to try and get some knight e6 with a double attack, but I think white can actually just play bishop d6, protect the pawn, move her bishop, and it's really tough to actually get this bishop out of d6. And again, 2 bishops, clear play on the queen side in the form of b4. And I think white is already significantly better. So I decided to take the pawn instead. But this comes, again, as a bit of a... there's some risk involved with grabbing the pawn, because my opponent played bishop e5, but during the game I was considering b4, which I believe was also the engine stop line, queen e7, and just b5, and immediately undermining this pawn chain in the center. Kind of a minority attack, but you're down a pawn on d4 basically. So you're using, the fact that my pieces are underdeveloped, that you have the 2 bishops, and potentially, it's actually very tough to deal with this, because like something I was considering was, let's say this maybe knight f6, takes, and rook c1, something along these lines. And again, if you play rook c8, bishop a6 comes. So this would be very unclear as to who is better. Maybe I could have played knight f6 and leave my knight on f8 for the time being, but it would be definitely an interesting and imbalanced game. My opponent plays bishop e5, which also makes a lot of sense, trying to activate the bishop immediately, but it's a little bit slower, and it gives me a chance to develop my pieces in response. So I do play knight f6. Not really afraid of the double pawns because I'm a pawn up, and the only advantage that white has right now is the pair of bishops. So even though my structure is ruined in a way, I can always give back a pawn and to even out the material and liquidate my opponent's initiative. She does decide to go f4, and I'm very happy with my move here. I thought for maybe, again, like 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, and I eventually did decide to play f5, which looks very ugly, to lock your bishop behind both of your pawns. Actually, all 3 of your pawns restrict the bishop. But I have a very, very obvious idea. If I'm given a lot of, a couple of tempi, I'll just put my knight on e4, and eventually she'll either have to move her knight or take and then fix my pawn structure, or in the long term I could eventually bring back the bishop through f6, bishop f7, and bring back the bishop that way. While my bishop is very stupid on g6, you could also argue that this knight on g3 is also just as stupid because it has no active squares, and it's also kind of tough to find a good square for the knight, because even on d4, like, this pawn is protected, right, by this stupid bishop. So the position would be, if white decides to play slow, definitely, I think, pretty good for black. And I think already after f5, it's really tough to sort of decide what to do with white, and my opponent naturally decides to grab back the pawn immediately with bishop d3, bishop f5. I did have the option of playing d4, which I was considering, but I failed to see that after e4 I could play queen d5, which I completely missed this move. Again, it makes a lot of sense. Basically, you leave this weak pawn, which will become a target in the future for the knight, and you defend the f5 pawn. You don't give the pawn away. So this was definitely an option which I missed, because I was only considering queen takes d4, but I thought after bishop f5, queen d2, the position would be more or less equal. Maybe white is even slightly better because I have some weaknesses on the king side. So instead I decided to long castle and just get my king out of the way of the action. Bishop takes f5, king b8. And now we can see that, my bishop is sort of no longer locked in because the pawn was captured. And my opponent, again, has an option of what she should do. Because I do have the d4 idea. Again, it's very strong and very playable. I have, potentially rook e8 ideas, and I want to also maybe eventually capture the bishop and activate my knight. My opponent chooses to play queen c3 and trade the queens. I believe I checked with the engine, and maybe queen d4 was a better way to try and force the exchange, because the rook is hanging on h8, so I don't really have much choice but to trade the queens. However, after queen c3, I happily traded. I traded in f5, and after knight d7, surprisingly, black is already, according to the engine, up like +1, more than pawn advantage for black. Even though the material is equal, it seems like the pieces are, more or less, there's not big initiative happening, but basically, black's knight has all of these juicy squares. And the thing is that my one pawn holds her two pawns back, and my queenside majority, on the other hand, can be pushed pretty uncontested with, b5, knight c5, something along those lines, and then maybe a5, and expanding, grabbing space. And we know space is an important advantage in chess. So after knight e7, my opponent thinks, and she decides to try and activate one of her rooks with rook h3, but it's definitely a step in the wrong direction, because after knight f6, rook g3, knight e4, the advantage is skyrocketing all of a sudden because, obviously, of the fork. And my opponent was banking on the fact that she has an intermezzo attacking the pawn on f7. However, I have a very, very cool, calm response with rook dg8, basically inviting her to take on f7, but then I would activate my rook on the second file, and basically white drops a pawn for no compensation, and white is just completely busted in this position. And the rest of the game was, more or less very smooth. Rook f7, my opponent decides to allow my rook to infiltrate on g2, but keeps her rook on the 7th, maybe hoping for some counterplay, but she's forced to long castle because of the rook g1 threat. And after long castles, I decided to grab the pawn on e2, now coming from the other side. This pawn is still weak. She plays rook d4, and I decide to activate my last piece, rook to g8, knight g7, rook e1 check, just so that after, if I played this immediately, and let's say she took on h5, rook g1, she would have rook d1. So just to eliminate this possibility, I decided to give a check first and then play rook g1. So now after knight h5, rook 8 g2 comes in, king b3, rook b1, king a3, knight h3, and it's an inevitable mate. And my opponent resigned. So I'm making a bit of a comeback, won 2 games in a row, now on 3 out of 4. Still, down about 5 rating points, so still need to make up some ground, but tomorrow we'll be playing someone even higher rated than today, so hopefully the game turns out well. And the game is at 4 p.m., and I'll catch you after the game finishes in its recap. I'll see you all then.